So yeah, my name's Gadi. I'm originally from South Africa. You can probably hear from the accent. I apologize that I have a little bit of hay fever, so my voice is not how it usually sounds. Been online for quite a while, since the 80s. Any other BBS users here from back in the day? Yeah, okay, 2, that's brilliant. And yeah, a lot of web experience, very active in the Meteor community. And I want to speak to you today about Famous. However, I want to drastically shorten this presentation. So by show of hands, how many of you have heard of Famous? How many of you have used Famous? Okay. All right. So, well, let's see how we go, and I'll adjust the pace accordingly. But ideally, by the end of this presentation, you're going to know what Famous is, how it works, why it's such a big deal, and most importantly, how to easily integrate it into your Meteor projects. So, firstly, the question is, why are we here today? And the reason is because we love Meteor. And I think the reason why we love Meteor so much is because Meteor has made it really, really quick, easy, and simple to build very high-quality apps. You no longer need an engineering team of 20 to 200 people to build really, really cool stuff like the big boys are doing. The question, however, is what's happening on mobile? So on mobile, I don't know if you guys are all aware, but last year was actually the tipping point where for the first time we had more mobile internet users than desktop internet users. So whereas before, it might have been a good idea anyway to have an app to kind of maximize your reach, now your reach is actually more on mobile than it was on the web before. So it's more critical than ever to actually have a mobile presence. So when we're speaking about mobile apps, there are a few things we look at. Obviously, we want a layout that fits the screen size and feels comfortable. We want to have access to the phone API for things like sensors, GPS, native authentication. We want to be on the App Store for discoverability. And obviously, the most important thing that I'm going to speak about today is you want to have this kind of native feel for your app. I'm sure all of us have been in the situation where we download an app from the App Store, and we're like, wow, well, this is like a static web page in an app container. That's useless. That's very bad user experience for your users. It creates a very negative impression. And so, all the time, we're trying to have this very kind of fluid, native feel for our apps. And the way most people are doing that now is they're having separate teams for their desktop application, for their mobile application, for Android and for iPhone. And if you're looking at someone like Google or Facebook, I forget the exact numbers, but I think it's anywhere from 50 to 200 people per team. And obviously that's completely out of reach for most of us. And what should be ringing home here is kind of the same advantage that Meteor brought to us in the beginning, where it's you don't have to be one of these massive companies with 200 engineers to build something good. So we want to have ideally one code base with HTML and JavaScript running in Meteor where this will run on any device. So in terms of answering these app expectations above, obviously we've got CSS media queries, and the UK is actually fantastic in terms of some of the mobile websites I've seen and how you guys have leveraged this. But obviously there are limitations. We're using CSS in ways that it was never really intended to do. And then in terms of access to the phone API and the App Store, we've got Cordova, which lets us take a HTML JavaScript app, package it on native, and if you're doing this in Meteor, you can of course do it in one line. So the only thing that's really been missing is this kind of app feel that we want in our application. And some of the more popular ways of doing this is obviously Ionic, which is a set of widgets where views very similar to what would appear on native and on all devices are kind of pre-packaged for you and you can use them. And this looks really good and it feels very good. The only problem is it's kind of at the very edge of what's possible. If you try to do anything on your own, obviously you're going to realize that you're going to face the same problems that Ionic faced building all the individual components. So you have a very limited set of stuff you can do. Then you've got things like React Native and Famous, which we're going to discuss now. So React, I'm sure everyone here has at least heard of React. I'm not going to get into it because it's beyond the scope of the lecture today. But you're talking about a rendering engine that's an alternative to Blaze, and it looks kind of like this on the right. So we've got a React class with a render function. We've got JSX, so we're returning a div in our JavaScript. And this will render into Hello John. And the reason why I bring up React without going into any more details is just to mention React Native. So what React Native does is it's a kind of hybrid approach, where in this template over here, instead of returning a div, you're returning a tab bar iOS component. And this hybrid approach works actually very nicely because you're building in a very similar way. Your structure of building your app is almost identical. But instead of returning HTML components, you're returning actually native components. So if you're turning this tab bar iOS, it's going to look, feel, and perform exactly how a native app would, because it is actually running on the native layer of the phone. The problem, however, is obviously suddenly you don't have a single code base anymore, because obviously there's no tab bar iOS on Android, and the implementations are different in every device. There is no Android support at the moment, although Android support is planned. There are very few modules available for using the hardware API of the phone. There is a guide on how to do it, but if you look at something like Cordova, you have all these modules already built for you, which is a big advantage. And the biggest issue for me personally, because obviously React Native is a fantastic solution for a lot of people, but I know for me, I'm kind of like leaving my familiar territory of HTML and JavaScript. Suddenly I can't do all the stuff that I could before. Anything that I've given across the native bridge to render, I can't touch anymore. And maybe one of the biggest consequences of this is, everyone doing React Native and Meteor has completely done away with Meteor client-side. They're building a pure JavaScript client with DDP and all custom implementations. And one of the big advantages for me of Meteor was this whole isomorphic world, where you can have one package that sits on the server and the clients, works perfectly together, and you'd have to give this up to use React Native, which for me was a deal breaker. So one of our other solutions was Famous. And I'm going to try to keep this short, but basically, you had these guys who were facing the same kind of problems, and were like, in a very similar way to what happened with Meteor, they were like, okay, well, instead of solving each one of these problems individually in our app, and everyone having to solve this on their own, let's solve this in the best way possible for everyone. Let's make a platform that anyone can use, which does all these things in the best way possible. And the way they did this was, so you're talking about the DOM, which is obviously the documents object model, which is great for documents. The problem is when you're doing an app and you want to have fantastic performance, well, everything that you draw has to be redrawn if it's moving at 60 frames per second. And the DOM is so slow, because you can imagine in a typical website, you have these massive nested structures, which all have their own positioning, and I'm sure all of us have done things like margin, -15px, and all these kind of things go on. And the browser just chokes when it tries to do this. I'm sure you've found some animation frameworks, and then you try to do 2 animations at once, and suddenly that like jitters or like lags, and that's not what people are willing to accept today. So yeah, there are a few other things which maybe we can come back to at the end if there's time. I've got some eye candy. We're not going through all of this. The slides will be available online afterwards. But I think what I really want to show you is this little show reel, which kind of summarizes a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about now.
As a brand, when I dream about what the internet can do for me, I dream of beautiful ads that inspire people to buy my products. I dream of beautiful interfaces that make people want to spend time on my websites. But the problem is that the technology we're given today just doesn't do it for us. Flash doesn't have reach, HTML5 doesn't have performance, and native costs too much. And it's out of that frustration that Famous was born, because we wanted to remove the gap between what you can dream and what you can build. So 4 years ago, we had a crazy idea. What if we took the same technology that's used to produce really high fidelity games like Halo and World of Warcraft? What if we took that technology and reverse engineered it in the only language that works on every device on Earth? JavaScript. And here's the thing, it took us 4 years, but it worked. And so now that brands are using Famous, we've been overwhelmed by the response. We've already achieved significant industry support, and brands are already using Famous in fascinating ways. They're taking all of their Flash ads and converting them over to Famous to finally get that reach that they wanted. Taking all of their native apps and they're converting them into Famous apps so they don't have to have 4 development teams, and they can deploy to all platforms and only build once. We're seeing lots and lots of different creative uses for brands. But overall, what we're seeing is that brands are finally empowered to remove that gap between what they want their brand to be and what it can be online.
Okay, so that's obviously a marketing video, but I think before I get into how you can use Famous in Meteor, I think it's quite important to understand their vision, which I think is amazing. And I'll speak about the pros and cons at the end of the talk. So yeah, what's very important before I carry on is just to give you a very brief history, because there are a few different parts of Famous floating around the internet now in different versions. So the first Famous beta came out in April last year. That's what's been around up until last month, the version 0.3 stable but deprecated release. And what came out last month is the new engine, aka mixed mode, which kind of handles only all the low-level stuff, and it does it really, really well. Maybe next time I can give a lightning talk just on how Famous optimizes everything. But it's a superb, superb job they've done, even in terms of not generating any garbage, because the garbage collector can ruin one of your frames. So they really have thought about some very deep level stuff, and then obviously all the gaming engine stuff that was mentioned already. Then what launched this week, which is very hectic to get into this presentation, was Famous Framework, also known as BEST, which is their way of building custom components that are reusable, very clean build process. So when you speak about components, just to clarify, because you're going to hear this a lot, in Engine, we have components that we attach onto nodes that are almost like a decorator. And then for everything else, when we talk about components, we're speaking about a closed system that we can reuse wherever we want. It might be a layout, it might be a widget like a carousel, and that kind of stuff. So yeah, very quick intro to Famous. We're starting off with the scene graph. The name might be familiar for those of you who have worked in gaming before, but just like you've got the DOM where HTML lives, you have the scene graph where Famous lives. And it's not a one-to-one mapping. Entire scenes are rendered either to your document body, in the case of a full-page app, or you can render just to one particular div in your app if you only want to use Famous for one particular thing that you're working on. So you have your scene, which is your root node. Nodes can have any number of children. And then the fun part is, for those of you that know the term composition over inheritance, instead of in HTML where you've got lots of kinds of nodes, like paragraph and bold and whatever else, in Famous you have one base node class, which you can extend. But generally what you do is you work with this basic instance and you add components onto it. And this is also a very familiar pattern in the gaming world. So a component can do things like size, position, rotation, and a component can also have a renderable part, like a DOM element, which is how we get stuff back on the DOM, and a mesh, which is like a WebGL, the equivalent in WebGL. So this is what a full tree looks like. You can see you have your big scene graph, where nodes have all these components on them. And as I mentioned, it's not a one-to-one mapping. So what happens is, this node over here affects all the children below it in terms of sizing, position, or whatever else. But only these child nodes are actually rendered to the DOM. So you have a kind of flat model where you don't, things that you're using for positioning don't land up on the DOM and affect performance. The way everything is absolutely positioned in this flat model is using Transform Matrix 3D, which is GPU accelerated. And obviously, we can absolutely position everything on our own, or we can use a layout and widget and do everything automatically. So here's how you'd actually build up a scene graph. Obviously, you've got the dependencies on the top. You initialize the engine, and then it's just a matter of making var scene as create scene, add child, etc., etc. So yeah, probably like me, you're seeing this and you're like, cool. Well, yeah, that's pretty much how I build web apps every day, all in JavaScript. Unfortunately, that's not very Meteor-y, and it's not very fast. So one of my initial motivations for Famous Views was to say, it's this whole idea of, well, I got to Meteor, and suddenly it got so fast, quick, and easy to build these amazing things. And now I'm doing huge amounts of JavaScript and huge amounts of code again, and that's not what I want. So that brings us to Famous Views. And a bit later, we're going to speak about Famous Framework as well. But the idea of Famous Views is to code Famous the Meteor way. It's been pretty popular, which is almost a little surprising because the API in the beginning was very unstable. But since about November last year, we're averaging about 1,000 downloads every month, which is great. Community support has been fantastic. And what it is, it's primarily a low-level wrapper around Famous. So the idea is you can take anything written in pure Famous, and very easily you can wrap it and then suddenly use it in Meteor like a regular Meteor component. And when I say that, I mean obviously, if you have reactive templates inside of it, those have to stay reactive, events have to work. If you have attributes, these need to support reactive helpers. And if you're dealing with cursors, you need to have some type of each loop, which honors insertion, removals, changes, and reorders. The other goal of the project is to make Meteor play nice with Famous. Some criticism in the past has been, okay, well, Blaze is a rendering engine. Famous is a rendering engine. You've now got two rendering engines fighting for control over the DOM, and it's a disaster. The thing is, Meteor's modular enough to actually modify to work fantastically in this kind of environment. So what we do in Famous Views is, all the things like Meteor set timer and all of that, we route through Famous's clock. We have like a defer. We handle like Meteor defer in a way that we queue up all the deferred functions. Every frame, we start running them, and then if we see we're taking too long, we pause that queue, render a frame, and then carry on where we left off. And we do exactly the same thing with implicit flushes of Tracker, for those who know Tracker well. The only problem, of course, is if you have a single running reactive function, which can block for more than a few milliseconds. And for that, we're working on a virtual DOM for Blaze, which you can read up more here. Basically, all we do is we kind of have a similar kind of queue where everything that Blaze does is queued up, and then we dequeue them according to a timer. If we're taking too long, we just pause, render a frame, and then come back. So in this way, Blaze is completely asynchronous, and it opens up the possibility in the future to have large parts of Meteor in a web worker in a separate thread, because you no longer have this dependency on having everything where the UI is based, where the DOM is based. And lastly, obviously, we want to have an ecosystem of lots of packages. In my previous talks, I think we've got about 20 packages, but they're all for the old version of Famous. And in the long term, I'd love to have some type of mashup where also, like Ionic, we have all these pre-built widgets, which are all in Famous and work perfectly with Meteor. So that's the long-term goal. So yeah, that was the dry part of the presentation. And now we get to the fun part, which is the live coding. Let me just make sure that we're still online. Yeah. OK, is that kind of visible, the code, or should I make it a little bit bigger? A little bit bigger. OK, I hope this is going to work, but just because of the size. OK, so we've got our body over here, and it's pretty much as you expect. So you can do like a scene, and this is how you build your scene. Obviously, it attaches to the element above. So in this case, it's the body for a full screen app, but it could just as easily just be a particular div in your app. And sorry, bigger. OK. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to turn out, but I'll try and adjust all the sizes accordingly. Is that better now? Can people see? Yeah. OK, fantastic. So what I'm doing now is pretty much that whole tree that we described before. I'm building now using template helpers. So if I go hello Meteor London, that comes up because the DOM element is how we get stuff from the scene graph back into the DOM. And this behaves kind of like a regular div. So we can do stuff like color white. Class, we've got a class downstairs, down here in CSS. Don't worry about all this other code, I'll get to that. That's code, you can see the comments. This is code that would actually normally be in an external package. It's only because everything's so new that I've got all this famous code here that I'll get to. And we can also do stuff like dir, RTL, so regular attributes. A node gets stuff like size, and you'll have to read up about the sizing, but we have something called absolute sizing, which in famous views has this type of CSS-inspired syntax. And then we can do stuff like, we can align it. So in Famous, a lot of stuff uses an array of x, y, and z axes values. So if with they go from 0 to 1. So if we're aligning this and we go 0.5, 0.5, you see this jumps to almost the middle. But you can see what it's actually aligned is the top left-hand corner of the div, because that's what we call the mount point, which defaults to 0, 0. But if we change that to 0.5, 0.5, we have a perfectly centered div. And, and it's amazing because it's such a simple thing. But if you try to do it in CSS, depending on how you've structured your app, it's either challenging, impossible, or in very rare cases, easy, but almost never easy. So yeah, that's fantastic. And obviously, you're letting new words here like mount points or whatever. But with two attributes, we've got a perfectly centered thing where no matter what's happening in the app, it'll always be perfectly in the center. As opposed to line and mount point, we can also do stuff like position, which is just with absolute values translating it across. And instead of putting an absolute value here, we can also use a helper. So now that we're in the JavaScript window, everything below this line, in theory, should be a separate package, but only for the demo now is it all here. This is all rule famous code, which we'll get to in a moment. But if we go template, body helpers, get position, so we can put an absolute value here. And sorry, that's a bug in Famous with a PR pending for it. That'll be fixed in the next release. And we can also have a function here that returns a value. And we can also make this reactive by putting in a reactive dependency. So if we have something like this, you won't be able to see what I'm doing here. But all I'm going to do is set a session variable. So if I go session set y 150. So everything works exactly exactly how you'd expect in Meteor in a very natural way. So I can move that around. Now instead of returning only a value, we can return an object with a value property and with a transition. The transitions take a duration of, let's say, 1 second, and various other things such as a curve. So if we do this, what happens now is we have this kind of bouncing effect. And you can see that was really easy. I mean, we really haven't done very much at all. It feels quite natural, and obviously everything's still reactive. The big surprise is that we're not even using the physics engine, which I kind of glossed over. But what we're doing now is an animation over a fixed amount of time with like a curve, which says, okay, well, depending on our point in time, this is where the object's going to be. But Famous also gives you a full physics engine, which hopefully I can demo briefly later, where you can say, this div is going to be like repelled or attracted to these divs, and you can have very natural feeling layouts. Where let's say if you want to have 20 objects on a screen, instead of figuring out where to put them, you just say, okay, well, they all have to fit and they're all repelled from each other. You just drop them in and they all kind of fit in. And there's even, for those of you that do know Famous and know Hein Rutgers, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, he's actually working, any iOS developers over here? Oh, none. One. Okay. So I don't actually develop in iOS, but one of the very popular things in iOS development is auto layout, where you use, what's it called? I think Castaway constraints or something like that. Yeah, use the constraint solver. So you kind of say, okay, well, I kind of want my layout to look like this. This is what's important, this is what's less important, and then whatever size you put it on, it all just kind of works. So pretty soon, with the new version, we're going to get that in Famous as well, which is also a massive deal, especially if you're talking about one code base. Oh, really? Okay. All right, well, I look forward to seeing how this is going to work in Famous, yeah.
How does Famous handle scrolling? Because you've obviously got the overflow scrolling, behavior is different from iOS to Android.
Okay, that is a very good question. And to be honest, I don't know the answer yet because the framework came out this week and I'm a little bit behind because I've been on holiday here. In the old engine, obviously they wrote a whole scroll view on their own. I've heard that maybe they're not doing this and relying more on native scrolls because, obviously on Safari it is actually kind of bouncy and like that. But if you ask a question in the forums, hopefully in a week when I've finished going through all the framework code, I'll have a better answer for you. Okay, so that's like our little helpers. And, you can imagine if you've got a physics engine and everything's responding reactively, it's a very comfortable way to build an app, which is great. So I want to move on to mixed mode. Obviously, all of this is in spacebars, which gets a little bit hectic with all the moustache tags. For those of you that know Jade, it really makes things a lot simpler. Unfortunately, there's no syntax highlighting, and the auto conversion is not perfect. But we can fix this up very quickly.
Jade and coffee is a good religion, right?
Yeah, so I never got into coffee, but I've been highly recommended it. And Jade is fantastic because, this practically looks like pseudocode to describe something. But this is actually all the code you need to actually draw something and render it. So let's do a bit of WebGL, and you'll see that it's also not so complicated. I think we're still okay for time. So for now, I'm going to get rid of this element. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, instead of a DOM element, we're going to have a mesh. We're going to give that some geometry of a box. And now I've got a little square over there. We can make it a little bit bigger. And we have down here, all in Famous, a spinner component. So the way we get something from Famous into Meteor with Famous views, and I'm just going to defer this because I want the code to be at the top. All we do is we go, for example, fu.wrap, we name it, and we give it. And now we can use it in our templates. So, if we have, for effects, let's just also align this again. Except this time, we can use all 3 axes because we're working in 3D. So we can go 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, mount point equals point. This is the most boring part of the demonstration. So now, just like we spoke about composability and composition over inheritance. So we've added a mesh component to this node, and we can also add a spinner component to this node. And what happens when we do that? This should be wrap component. Is now it's spinning. And it's still spinning from the left-hand corner because just like mount point, we've got something called origin. So now if we want to spin from the very center of of the thing. We do it like this. And now you're thinking, okay, well, that looks pretty ugly because it's all one color. And the way we really appreciate 3D is with a bit of light.
Between mount point and origin.
So mount point is for positioning, anything like alignment and position. And origin is for any type of rotation or scaling or any type of transform works for origin. So now let's make another node. We can actually put it pretty much in the same place. The only difference is we're going to now take some position, and this works from our mount point. So we're going to keep it on the same x and y axis, but move it 250 pixels higher. And to this node, we're going to attach something called a point light, which we can give a color of, let's say, white. And now we've got proper rendering on the GPO of very cool stuff. This can get like a base color of, let's say, I don't know, green. And obviously, you can mix up things however you want. So in terms of mixed mode, if you're wondering what mixed mode is, the very revolutionary thing about the new engine is the ability to actually mix DOM and WebGL in the same coordinate space. So what I can do now, let me just change this to a torus. So we've got a mesh component, we've got a spinner component, and now let's add a DOM element. Now this is all to the same node. So if we have, let's just build this up again. DOM element, sorry, there's still a few bugs. This is preview code. But if I do that, so you can see our div is actually in the dead center because we've mounted it with all the same coordinates. And that's quite a big deal because usually to get things to overlap, the DOM model uses one coordinate system. WebGL uses an entirely different coordinate system. But now we have one scene graph where everything automatically just fits in the right place. And obviously this is a regular div. You could have regular Meteor reactivity happening in there, whatever else. And if we go, if we take it one step further, and sorry, this isn't aligning only because I've zoomed in by like 400%. But instead of using a torus, we're taking a wavefront object file. We're coloring it all in JavaScript. And so this is all WebGL, and the screen is actually a iframe. And I promise you, on regular zooming, it lines up perfectly. And it's completely usable. It's exactly what you could normally... I'm actually quite upset because the example on the famous website goes back to the famous website. Unfortunately, it's broken when I look today. But you can actually, on the laptop, you can go to the page with the laptop demo and then get another laptop in the laptop and just keep on going. And that's pretty amazing. I'm upset that that's broken. But this example is still good. And obviously, you can see exactly what's going on here. You've got scene, camera, device, which is just another template. And these building blocks can do very, very powerful stuff. And why mixed mode is such a big deal is because, WebGL isn't so great at rendering. We have a lot more fun stuff we can do with text in the DOM. And more importantly, there are a few things that kind of rely on the DOM, like, I don't know, search engines and SEO. So, if you build your app all in WebGL, nothing can crawl it. But if you build very cool stuff like this, and you put all your text, through mixed mode, your site is crawlable, obviously through the usual Meteor hacks or Phantom.js or when we get server-side rendering. And, for things like accessibility and whatever else, everything will work kind of how we usually do. All we've really done is made things like a lot cooler with relatively very little effort. So, let's get rid of this. And the last thing I want to show you, okay, we're going to start off almost fresh. We're going to get rid of this and this. Okay, so we wrapped like a spinner component, and there are a few other things I want to wrap. Down here we've got some like layout functions, demo layout 1 and demo layout 2. And exactly the same way, all we do is we say, okay, wrap demo layout 1, demo layout 1. And now again, we can just use them in Meteor as if they're regular Meteor template helpers or whatever else. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say, okay, well, right over here, let's use this layout, demo layout 1, and let's indent this. Okay, there are a few things that don't auto-refresh. Now I'm going to go a lot smaller. Also, there's shortcuts for size. You don't have to type this whole thing out every time. You can just go A100. Okay, that's a bug that I mentioned before. But what you can do now in this layout, so demo layout 1 is something very similar to just like an inline block element. So you just keep going. and actually we can get rid of all this alignment stuff. And this kind of just fills up pretty much how we'd expect. Again, things are slightly off because of the zooming, but I think it's okay. But now instead of obviously building things up from scratch, wouldn't it be great if we got them from the database? So let's assume that we have a people collection that's loaded at the very bottom of this page. And all we do is we go return people.find, and that's regular mini Mongo cursor. And what we can do now is we can say, okay, well, let's go famous each, and that's our version of each people. And the minute we move this up, let's just check here. Then it's coming from the database. So let's assume that instead of text in our people thing, we've got URLs, like a URL property of those documents. And what we get now is things coming from the database. So yeah, this is the people collection is everyone who said they were attending the meetup today, which is cool. And I think to really get the most out of this demo, we're going to have to even go. Well, I need one. Okay, I'm going to zoom out once I finish. So now instead of demo layout 1, which is quite boring because we can do that anyway, what if we use demo layout 2? So let me just get completely ready here with everything because I'm going to have to maybe zoom out a little bit. But all I'm going to do, I'm going to change this 1 to a 2, and that's like a pre-made component. We also have a people class, and I think that's it. So we go demo layout 1 to demo layout 2. Sorry? Oh, yeah, I'm going to, no, I think we're okay. So we're going to go from 1 to 2, and we're going to go full screen and redraw. No, that's wrong. Something's, wait, I don't know what happened. The sizing's a little bit, oh, sorry, this class should be person. Okay, now we can do that again. We can go full screen. And all we really changed was one layout. We work in Meteor just how we usually do. Everything comes from the database, and it's super easy. And obviously, I mean, this looks and feels pretty good. Your app has become a lot more alive and exciting with very little work. Because the big idea of Famous Views is kind of to remove the barriers of entry to actually make your app cool. And obviously, this is using like a beta version of the Famous engine. These pictures are actually all full-size images, which I was too lazy to scale down like in the files. But I think even with all that in mind, if you go, this demo's on the slide deck as well. If you go in with your mobile phone, you're going to see the same kind of performance, which will still get even better in the next release. So yeah, that's all the live coding, and now we can start. Thanks. Thanks, guys. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's in the demo. This is also backup in case things didn't work. And yeah, briefly about Famous Framework. So at around the same time that I started working on Famous Views for Meteor, a guy called Zach Brown started working on Famous Angular for Angular. And obviously, we all kind of drew the same conclusions and kind of arrived at the same kind of setup. And now Zach works at Famous, and together with his team, he's made something called Famous Framework, which also helps you design things on the pure Famous level in a similar kind of way. So it's called BEST, Behaviors, Events, States, and Tree. And in terms of Blaze, well, this is your template. States are reactive variables. The behaviors, these are actually, the format's different, but these are reactive functions. And events are just like template x.events. So things are very similar. I know for myself personally, I'm still going to prefer, to kind of build things like the Meteor way. So I think if you're building like a plain Famous component, and with the disclaimer that I haven't really seen, Framework came out this week and I haven't looked at it too much yet. But my suspicion is that if you're building something in pure Famous, like a very cool layout or component, you're going to do that in BEST. But then when you're assembling everything together on the app level, probably going to want to use Meteor because that's your familiar workspace. That's where you've got your full stack and all the isomorphic goodness that's happening. So hopefully next week we're going to add Famous Framework support, where you can take any community components and just drop it in to your Meteor app, just like we did with those other engine elements. So yeah, starting to wrap up. In terms of pros, I think this is like quite a big deal. It's kind of hard to really, I hope I managed to like kind of enthuse you with the kind of passion and excitement that I have about this. I haven't seen anything else that offers quite this level of performance and flexibility. There are a few other solutions that do small parts of this, but Famous has like $30 million behind them, and they're going to keep working full time to just make this better and better for us to use, which is great. And the attitude is great. In the past, we've had a Famous Views competition, and they wrote on the Meteor Talk mailing list. They're just like, oh, anyone submitting an entry to the Famous Views competition, if you're in the San Fran area, just pop around the lab. We'll sit with you one-on-one. We'll help you build awesome stuff. So that attitude is very welcome. Obviously, on the negative side, and I feel it is important to put things in perspective. So firstly, we are dealing with a pre-1.0 release. But I'm sure there's no shortage of people here who started off with Meteor before 1.0. And I'm sure we agree that it was all still worth it, as long as we realize that things might still change, and there might still be bugs or missing features that we need. And those are all coming. So back to the cons. Historically, Famous has had kind of bad communication. Like people are logging on to their Slack community now and saying, I went to the website to go back to the API reference, and I see there's a whole new API. And that was quite unpleasant for a lot of people. I know, anyone doing serious work in Famous, we've kind of known for about 8 months now that the whole API was going to change. But it shouldn't really be our responsibility to get that information. And that's like an area where Famous need to improve, also with transparency. So what kind of happened is, for most of this year, there's kind of been like a lot of like dead time, because Famous were working full time on the new version. And kind of got very quiet, so people were, posting issues like, "Are you guys still alive? Is Famous like vaporware?" But now everything is starting to launch and come out, which we'll go through now. But I think now that all the stuff is out the door, I think we can expect like a lot better stuff coming from Famous Industries. My other kind of gripe is that there's been like a big focus on like very low-level stuff. So you'll kind of, you'll watch like a demo day, and they'll show you like our solar system. With the sun, with like planets rotating around the sun, and they're like, yeah, the sun is a div, and the planets are a div, and all the divs are floating around in physics, and you're like, wow, that is absolutely amazing. And then you're like, well, unless I want my menu to be like the sun with all the options kind of floating around, it's actually like a lot less useful. So the thing is, they've built this like amazing engine, which is, if you want to build your own type of new revolutionary user interface, you can do it, and that's amazing. But I figure most of you, like me, we're more interested in like using something like Bootstrap as opposed to building something like Bootstrap. And I think this is something, hopefully, that Famous Framework is going to address. And we're going to start seeing a lot of reusable components coming out at that level of Famous. And lastly, I do like to be completely honest. I do kind of also feel that sometimes they generate a little bit too much buzz prematurely. So, you saw like the marketing video, which I think is excellent, and I agree with completely, because that vision is exactly what's going to happen. But I think, a lot of people kind of, Framework mentioned very specifically that it was in alpha, but I know when the new engine came out, some people, I knew it was going to be in beta, but some people kind of went in there and they're like, oh, is this a new engine? Like, it's amazing, but like, where's all like the supporting material? And like some of the docs like weren't like 100%. But the minute you do understand that it is in beta and that it is a pre-1.0 release, these things become a lot more bearable. And in terms of transparency, things have improved a lot. If you look at GitHub, the Famous developers have actually been really good recently in terms of showing pull requests and discussion on the issues, and stuff is really getting fixed up at a nice pace. And I think probably the next release is going to be very decent for Famous. But as you saw, we already have like Famous Views running around the current release. There's already like a live code editor running around it. So that's fantastic. And yeah, sorry, I mentioned components. They're going to take the top 10 jQuery components and turn them into like Famous reimagined components, which I think is going to be fantastic. We'll be able to use them in Meteor. And yeah, a lot of stuff is coming our way. So last time, just to go over everything, because I think you'll enjoy this a lot more if you realize, again, where everything's at. The engine came out last month in beta. Framework came out this week in alpha. Famous Hub I haven't mentioned. But obviously, there are a lot of people who are doing Famous outside of Meteor. So there's a little bit of an overlap. You can deploy your stuff to free to the Famous Hub. And then with one line of JavaScript, you can put it in any app regardless of your framework. But this kind of stuff is possibly less interesting for Meteor developers, depending on what you're doing. And in the future, they're going to have a lot more tooling from analytics and hot code pushes to, the idea is, I don't know if you remember in the video, but it's like, you're going to have usually what happens, an engineer designs something and then has to sit for hours with the designers trying to get it to be exactly how you want for your app. And the idea with this is your engineer will build something, let's say using the best methodology, upload it to Famous Hub, and then your developers will actually, it will analyze all your code, if understood correctly, and your developers will actually be able to, on Famous Hub, fine-tune what your engineer has designed exactly according to how they want it to behave, exactly how they want it. Famous Views, as you saw, is working very well with Engine, and I hope to add framework support next week. So in both cases, you've got very strong foundations to start building stuff now, but there isn't so much ready-made stuff yet, and I think that's going to start happening kind of now. So it's actually a very fun time to get involved. That's it. Any questions? Thanks. Thank you. I'm sorry, yeah.
Okay, when you've got DOM elements flying about all over the place, okay, I really don't know how that works, it's cool. But do events work the same way? Can I click on stuff when it's being transferred?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, so the question was when all these things are flying around and we're saying that they're DOM elements being transformed, do they still work like a regular DOM element? Can you attach events to them? Can you interact with them? Yeah, absolutely. You saw with that iframe spinning around, it was still a regular iframe with a normal website running inside of it. Meteor events will work like normal inside of a DOM element. Obviously, you can't span the template. For that, you'd need like a famous event to work on the scene graph level. Yeah. No? Okay, yeah.
So how layers work in this case? Let's say you have WebGL and then a DOM element and then WebGL on top. Like, how would this work?
In terms of like overlap?
Yeah, if overlapping, like, can you put like a DOM element between two WebGL elements, for instance?
Yeah, so the question is, how does everything interact? If you've got like lots of DOM elements and WebGL elements, like do they intersect? Can you see through things?
Yes, you have multiple canvas running.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how they do it, but Famous does something called cutouts, where they'll work out exactly what size and what orientation your DOM element is, and then cut that out of the WebGL element so everything just like shines through. Which is also another cool thing because it's all in the same coordinate system. So it gets very easy to do stuff like that, which is cool. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I appreciate all of the lighting stuff that you're doing on WebGL, and previously there was a lot of CSS 3D animations going on. Is there like kind of two modes which it's setting itself up in? Is it using CSS 3D as a fallback and you can't deal with the crazy
yeah,
WebGL lighting, or like, is it flip-flop?
Okay, so the question is, how do you deal with like the lighting and like how are we using CSS for like what parts and where's the overlap? So I mean the only thing we're using a lot of in CSS is the the transform matrix 3D, which is GPU accelerated, and then the WebGL. Obviously for decoration, we can still use regular CSS inside of a DOM element, and that's exactly how we usually would do, but not for animation, because not all CSS animations are accelerated. So everything that's happening, all the recalculations, and maybe I can actually quickly show it if I didn't close it. Okay, well let me just, hold on, 1 second, I'm going to go back to that demo. This one. So what I can do now, and sorry, I will come back to the light, but all of these are regular DOM elements. I can go inspect elements, and I know it's hard to see, so small, but these are all regular divs with like the picture inside of it, and it's just the style matrix transform 3D with height and opacity, and then you can see over here these are all actually 60 times a second. Obviously, the minute I'm showing it, it's not as fast, but you can see 60 times a second these are being updated, and everything happens on the GPU. So that's fantastic. In terms of lighting and everything, so yeah, obviously WebGL and DOM are two completely separate beasts, but the minute we're using them in the same coordinate system where things can shine through, you just get the best of both worlds, because you can do most of your web page in the DOM, but like everything around it or like on it is happening in WebGL. And what we actually did for that laptop demo, I don't know if you saw like the reflection on the screen. So obviously the DOM can't reflect stuff, but all we do is we put a transparent mesh, like a plain mesh, in front of that screen, and then that'll reflect the light.
So iframes are CSS 3D transformed.
Yeah. So obviously that's being made to fit. Right. And then the DOM obviously can't reflect light, but with a plane in front of it, that will reflect the light, and it looks just as good. No one knows the difference.
I wasn't sure if you're doing a kind of like HTML to canvas, like you have that HTML.js or whatever. Like you can redraw the DOM to a canvas, and then you're using that.
No. We're not doing that. We're not doing that. So text will not be blurred. things will still look very good, and it's still all crawlable, and it really is in the real DOM.
Right.
And the canvas, everything will just like line up. Yeah.
How many in your team?
Sorry?
How many in your team?
On famous views. Well, it's mostly just me. Someone else I'd like to mention is Pem, Pierre-Eric Merchandet, has done a lot of great work, also especially on the last version. In fact, the slide deck, he wrote the slide deck. This is all a famous views app using iron router for routing and famous views for everything in the middle. And McBain has also done a lot of work. He did the MGN famous package. But yeah, it's mostly just me, and I'm meant to have a full-time job where I'm meant to be building an app. And I'm kind of like, well, I'm going to use famous views to build my app, so I can kind of just do that during work time. But I can't do that forever. But we do get PRs in, and it is catching on, which is very nice.
Okay, we have
Okay.
a pretty short time.